Lucy, you're muted. I'm not sure if you are talking to us, but you're muted.
Blah, 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 blah. Here we go. Okay. So I've been talking to myself. How many times have we said to ourselves over the last couple of years, you're muted, or to somebody else? We should know better at this point in time after using Zoom for so many hours. Welcome, everyone. My name is Lucy Gray. I'm the co-founder of Actionable Innovations Global. We meet every Friday to think about innovation in education. And today we have a really special guest, Michael Furdyk, who's a longtime friend of ours. And we'll introduce him in a moment. But I just want to make sure that everybody is settled. And if people can make sure they're muted until we have the Q&A portion of the discussion, that would be fabulous. We are a professional learning community that is intended to be really inclusive. We want to support and inspire education leaders and innovation leaders in general. We host conversations like this, and we connect people through a online community at actionableinnovations.global. And we also write on a Medium publication, and we're always looking for contributors to this. So if you would like to join us, you're more than welcome to in our community and on our Medium publication as well. We used to be known as the Global Education Conference Network, and we have different leadership and a different name and branding. So you may know us from a virtual education conference that we put together for the last, 10 or so years. So that's what we do. And if you want to know more about us, or if you want to get involved, you can email me at Lucy Gray Consulting, or you can join our community at actionableinnovations.global. We also are on social media. This Linktree link will send you to our YouTube channel and other channels. This recording will be available in YouTube later on tonight, along with other conversations that we've had over the last several months. So feel free to go to Linktree/actionable.inno, and you can find all the resources that we have available for people. Today, I would love for you to introduce yourself in the chat. Tell us who you are, where you're from, what your role is, if you're comfortable with it, and if you want to put your Twitter handle or LinkedIn profile link into the chat, that would be great. This is intended to be kind of a networking event, so you can grow your personal learning network, and we would love to connect with you. So put your information in there if you feel so inclined. If you want to invite people to this or tweet out any pithy comments, you can use the hashtag GlobalEd22. That's what we use for kind of streamlining our tweets. And unless you're speaking, it's really great to have the mic muted, so we just don't have a lot of background noise. So we're so happy to have you all here. And let me tell you a little bit about Michael. So Michael can probably give his life story a little bit better than I can, but he's been a friend of the Global Education Conference Network for a long time. And he's actually been Taking It Global is the youth activist network that he has started. And he has many, many projects that emanate from that he's going to tell us about. And particularly A Connected North is one project where he is working with Indigenous people in the north of Canada and connecting them to learning opportunities. So I'll let him explain that a little bit further as we go along. You can follow him at Taking It Global, at Furdyk, and at Connected North. Those are the Twitter handles that he uses. And if you were with us last night for Global Ed Chat on Twitter, you might have gotten a little bit of tidbits about what Michael's been up to, and I'm really excited to share his work with you because it's pretty phenomenal. So welcome, Michael. How are you?
I am great. Thanks so much, Lucy. And yeah, maybe I will just start just by taking a moment to acknowledge that I am coming to you today from Treaty 13 territory here in Toronto, Canada, home traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and really excited to spend the next 52 minutes with all of you having a great discussion.
And I'm also really curious about one thing I'd love to talk to you too about as we get going is how Canada has approached First Nation peoples as opposed to the U.S. I think it's kind of a fascinating topic, and it seems like Canada's done a lot of work on that in that regard. So hopefully we'll get into that in a minute. first I'm going to let Don give you the Proust questionnaire, which is our Don has taken the Vanity Fair questionnaire and turned it around for educators. And so I'm going to stop sharing and let you guys kind of warm up by going through some of Don's questions.
That sounds great. And I don't know if I broke the rules, Don, because I was like, let's focus on these more positive questions. I feel like we'll end the week on a positive note. So feel free to throw some at me.
Okay, yeah. Okay, thanks for coming on, Michael, and welcome everyone. Yes, so the Proust questionnaire is sometimes used by interviewers today. Proust himself answered all the questions in a form of a confession book album, a form of parlor game from the Victorian times. And interestingly, 1022 is the year of Proust. I was just reading this, it's his centenary. So I was just learning that earlier. But let's throw some questions at you. And these are also for everyone else in our audience today. Please put your answer in the chat. And so let's start with this one, Michael. What words or phrases do you most overuse?
Other than you're muted, Lucy, we were talking about, I think for me, one of the big ones that we kind of talk a lot about in our work is aligned. This is aligned to the curriculum, or this is aligned to the strategy, or, I was kind of reflecting on these questions and I was thinking that's probably the one that we kind of talk most about. And the second place would probably be strategic. We're always, especially in the nonprofit sector, with limited resources and limited time, I think we're always talking about being strategic, doing the most strategic thing, making strategic use of our time. Everything has to be strategic.
Yeah, I hear you. Yeah, that word aligned is so overused. It's one of those sort of showstoppers. People say aligned, and then there's a silence, because you have to be aligned. You can't be misaligned, God forbid.
Of course, this is aligned, right?
Exactly. Okay, question 2 for Michael and for our audience. What talent would you most like to have?
It's a good point. I see Larry in the chat too talking about awesome. That's probably I'm probably guilty of that. You can count my awesomes today. I think in terms of talent, being someone who grew up digital, grew up learning programming languages and things like that, I think, I'd love to have a talent of writing error-free code on the first try. I'm someone who loves to just kind of make changes live. I don't like to do a lot of testing. And so I'm sometimes breaking things. But yeah, I think a cool talent would be to always have every line of code be free of errors. So that was my kind of talent, maybe from an engineering point of view. Flawless code.
Yeah. No, I hear you about testing. I'm a big prototyper of everything, and even that's why I published the Proust questionnaire. I would never put anything in front of anyone unless I do it first myself. Because you need to test it on yourself, see how you react and stuff. Anything in the chat, Lucy, that's worth?
A lot of musical talent. Say Lucy, sing and dance.
Yeah,
I was in the choir back in the day, but that wasn't for me. Even keel personality.
I'd love to be. Judy is saying that she'd love to play the guitar. I would too. I would absolutely love to do that. I think that's a great talent. And then Larry, he wants to have an even keel personality at all times for all people, which is funny because I think he does have that. I've always associated Larry as having a very calm demeanor, so that's funny. We have Peace Builder. Nicole is saying Peace Builder. That's a great one. So yeah, I think we all have talent. We wish we had different talents. But okay, keep going.
Okay, so number 3, I will ask you, what is your most treasured possession?
Oh, Jody, speak more languages. That's a great one too. I was just thinking my first language growing up was Ukrainian. I'm trying to relearn it on Duolingo now, but yeah, I think that's often a regret not paying enough attention here. In French class, we'd love to have more command of those languages. For me, in terms of treasured possessions, I keep all of my conference badges. I've had the honor of speaking and being part of a lot of conferences over the last 2 decades, and I have quite a treasure chest of badges. I've always kept the badge from each conference, just those memories of meeting people, sharing ideas, being inspired, learning things. some pretty cool ones. I think one of my favorite experiences, I had the opportunity to speak at TED in 2001, which was the year before it was acquired and became like a whole different thing. But really the honor of attending and speaking and sharing ideas at conferences is kind of transferred into this big box of badges. And I hope someday I have a kind of a trifecta collection of conference badges, boarding passes, and hotel room keys. So I kind of imagine one day having like a museum room with just to kind of remember all of these amazing places, which are really about people and ideas that I was so privileged to be exposed to and exchange. So lots of ISTEs in there too. It's been awesome to connect with Lucy over so many years at ISTE, and yeah, so many great events, both individual and ongoing ones that have had the opportunity to repeat.
Yeah, I hear you, Michael. That's one of Don's overused words. I hear you. But I definitely hear you about the badges. I have a very hard time getting rid of conference badges too. But what I do with mine is I keep them in my most treasured possession, which are tote bags.
I did see your tote bag list there. Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
And Lucy, the thing that's funny about TED, this was if you can imagine, this 2001, it was the year before they like recorded and actually started publishing the TED Talk. So all I remember is being super nervous, a really interesting experience, but also the other speakers, the founders of Google were there that year. And such an interesting time as the internet was kind of being born and as we were starting our journey of taking it global. So yeah, wildly different perspectives there for sure.
Yeah,
All right.
and TED resumed this year. I knew one person who went, at least. I think was it in Canada this year? They resumed.
They've moved it to Vancouver permanently. Yeah, from Monterey. I guess they get a lot more mileage on their US dollars up here. Vancouver loves it, but the prices increased substantially too. I think it's like a minimum of $10,000 to attend now.
Well, people can always come here instead of TED for free. and hear some of the world's most inspiring people like you. So thanks for coming, and thanks for being with us and giving your time to us today. Don, any more questions for Michael?
Yeah, let's do one more one. So here it is, Michael, and for our audience. What is your greatest regret?
Regrets are tough. I mean, I think from like a purely financial point of view, my son is now 10, and when he was maybe 2 or 3, I learned about this thing called Bitcoin, and was learning about it. I set up a computer. I was doing some like Bitcoin mining, and it kind of seemed like a bit of a waste of time. And the computer was loud, to do this mining stuff, and so I got rid of it. Got rid of the computer and like sold the 60 or 70 Bitcoin, whatever I had farmed. So that would have been worth a substantial sum today. And lots of people have those stories. I think someone used what would now be $100 million of Bitcoin to buy a pizza back in the day. So my story's not quite as painful, but that's the only thing, it would be nice to have that have not made that decision.
Wow. Okay. Well, Michael, thanks for humoring me with my Bruce questionnaire. And
My pleasure.
audience, if you were answering, thank you as well. And this goes back to Lucy.
Thanks, Don. I appreciate that. So, Michael, you said something that I did not know. You mentioned something. Are you of Ukrainian descent?
I am, yeah, both sides. Both of my grandparents came to Canada from Ukraine during World War II. Mm-hmm.
Oh, wow. So, so do you have family there now that you are aware of or in touch with?
I do have a distant family. Before coming, my grandfather was previously married and had a son there. So his son and I guess his partial grandchildren, kind of half grandchildren, are there. So they're all safe, and we have a number of Taking It Global team members there that we work with on different technical projects too. So far, my family and our kind of extended team are all safe and doing okay. Most of them are in the West or closer to the West of the country, but yeah, it's pretty hard to believe what continues to happen.
Yeah.
In Ukraine.
Absolutely. And our community is built on a platform called Ning, which has been around for a long time, and it was started here in the U.S. and then bought by a company in India. And then I don't know where the current owners are, but most of I'm assuming Ukraine, because the chief technology officer and other people are in Ukraine. And last week I didn't know this and was complaining on their creator site about how the search function was not working in my Ning. And somebody said, well, they might be a little busy right now because the top tech people for the platform are in Ukraine. So I don't know what their story is exactly, but there's some ties there. And it immediately made me feel like I needed to, that my search problem was a first world problem that really could wait until they're in a better situation. So we appreciate Ning and how they're taking, they're apparently the platform is up in the cloud with Amazon. So there's no danger of it going away, but there's, the people we're concerned about. So tell us a little bit about your background. I know some of it, but you really started out being a youth activist yourself, and have grown that into taking it global. And I think your tech background is really interesting, and I would love it if you would share it with people, kind of how you got started with
Sure.
all this.
Yeah, and actually, I was going to mention just on the Ukraine front, but also relevant to kind of the story. Someone asked me yesterday about my Twitter avatar, but also on Twitter, this picture here is my dad and I in front of the Commodore 64, which was really where that kind of growing up digital experience began back in 1984. So I was 2 years old, and we got a Commodore 64, and learning, kind of growing up with that experience, both using the software, and that was actually a box you can make out on the right. Actually, Fisher Price made software back then, but also at a young age, learning coding and learning basic programming, and the idea that I wasn't just a consumer, but that computers unlocked the ability for us through coding and programming and engineering to become creators too. Writing my own program. I think it was in grade 4 or 5, a game to talk about something we were studying in school was pretty powerful, pretty cool to do. So I would say before, the kind of activism was just an interest in technology. And when the World Wide Web came about, I think it was AOL and CompuServe that were sending those discs in the mail to try to get you on. I think it was about middle school when I got on what became the World Wide Web around 1996. And what kind of fascinated me was, as someone growing up digital, was this idea of being able to right click on any page and view source. And so, being able to look at like Microsoft, Intel, like the companies that were emerging back then, and looking at their source code, being able to build, a website just like they did, that inspired my friends and I to create a website that was called the Internet Exposed, and then became mydesktop.com, which by the time we were in high school became one of the world's largest kind of computer magazines online. We had about 1 million monthly readers, looking at about 5 or 6 million page views of content. And we were all just in high school, part-time after school, writing emails to tech companies saying, if you want us to review your product, your video game, your monitor, send us your products, right? So we kind of launched our own journalism initiative that became pretty popular, but then we faced a bit of a challenge about not knowing how to incorporate a business, not being able to get a venture capitalist to take us seriously. So we sold that company when I was in grade 12. It wasn't for tens or hundreds of millions, but it was enough to, for most of us to like buy a condo and think about what we wanted to do next. And for me, that year was kind of special because it was the year the United Nations announced the Millennium Development Goals. And I was reflecting on how I wanted to use my tech skills next. My two kind of co-founders, one from Australia, one from Canada, they were already on to the next startup idea. But for me, I was having a conversation with a friend about my educational experience. I was feeling pretty disengaged as a high school student. And that was also the same year the Partnership for 21st Century Skills released their kind of seminal report. And one of the quotes that stood out to me there was, the education system faces irrelevance unless we bridge the gap between how students live and how they learn. And that resonated a lot with me and kind of crystallized this vision for taking it global, which was, what if we could create an online learning community where young people like us around the world could understand and act on real world problems, on these Millennium Development Goals, on, social issues that we all cared about. And it's exciting to kind of share this moment. It's Earth Day today. How can we create this pathway to action? Our tagline of inspire, inform, and involve was really intended to inspire everyone to go from, okay, it's great to be aware, but what can we do both in our own action and in policy change to create change around that? So that's what kind of led us to launch this initiative, this idea. It took us about a year to build our first website, and we were thrust into an opportunity to help young people participate in 2002 in Johannesburg in the World Summit on Sustainable Development. So that actually partially began like an environmentally focused part of the journey, where for the first time ever, youth, students from around the world were actually officially acknowledged by the United Nations as a stakeholder group. You know, their opinion was validated and mattered, and we were among the organizations that helped to bring together and accredit young people there at that conference. And that began a journey through the 2000s. The World Summit on the Information Society happened next in Tunisia and in Geneva, and that actually played a huge role in unlocking funding for technology and education, technology for development, especially in the so-called developing world. You know, we did a lot of work all across West Africa and Southeast Asia with youth-driven, we called them National Information Society youth campaigns. You know, young people raising awareness about the opportunity technology offered to improve education and an economic opportunity. So that was kind of how the story began, and it was kind of in the late 2000s when we had the privilege of working with some amazing young people on our team, Alina and Ariel, who were both First Nations leaders in Canada, and today run their own environmental NGO, Indigenous Climate Action. And they did a global mapping of Indigenous youth and helped us realize the digital divide in our own backyard. The fact that our own, many of our communities in Canada, many northern communities, most of our territories, the 3 territories in the north, are often excluded from programs and are often disconnected. So I kind of inspired this last decade of work that has been increasingly focused here at home in Canada, although we still do some of that global work too. So I'll just stop there, but that was kind of the genesis of the story and that journey from growing up with a Commodore to building websites to then deciding to kind of pivot to a charity and to creating impact around the Millennium Goals and now the SDGs.
So give us a sense of what the, kind of pivoting to the First Nations work that you're doing. What has been the context in Canada for righting wrongs of the past and trying to make amends for how Indigenous peoples have been treated? And it seems like Canada's been really on the forefront of this, and maybe there's some lessons here in the US that we could learn. And we also have people from other countries here too today, so they may not be necessarily aware of what's been going on in Canada, but it's fascinating to me. And this also and then you can and then tell us a little bit about a connected north and how that fits into it. And
yeah, I think that I would say we're still at the beginning of that journey. I think that there was a Truth and Reconciliation Commission formed. And for those who don't know, essentially there was there were several policies, a residential school system that was created by the government, implemented by a number of different churches, where students, Indigenous students, First Nations, Métis, and Inuit are the 3 Indigenous groups in Canada, and many students were forcibly removed from their homes and forced to attend these schools. And often those schools, well, in all cases, those schools were essentially designed to repress the culture, and in many cases there were horrific incidents of abuse that occurred as well. So there was the residential school system. There was also in the Arctic many instances of forced relocation, where communities were forced to move for many different reasons, whether it was resource extraction or convenience of the government or the process of colonization in the day. But those systems and many other incidences have led to intergenerational trauma and to a number of different issues facing those communities that I would say that while there has been progress, there would probably be broad agreement that we're still at the beginning of that journey of reconciliation and healing, and there's a long way to go. But the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which had a number of survivors of this school system testify, share their experience, created a set of essentially calls to action for different stakeholder groups, for government, for the education system, for the church, for citizens. And so as an organization, we're working to try to address some of those calls to action. And I would say much of our work focuses on strengthening representation in learning. So Connected North is a program that was actually founded and was inspired by our current Governor General, Mary Simon, who at the time, about a decade ago, was the head of the ITK, which is the Inuit People's Assembly, representing Inuit all across the North, but particularly in Nunavut, where she was speaking at a conference about the challenges facing the communities in the North, particularly the lack of access to mental health services and often the disconnect of the educational experience from the interests and priorities of students, and the fact that often they weren't able to see themselves represented in their learning. And because they didn't have in those smaller communities some of the experts and institutions that we have in the South, they weren't able to access a lot of different learning. And so Cisco donated to date over $10 million of equipment, video conference equipment that's kind of Fortune 500 company quality, telepresence systems. They worked with satellite providers to increase and donate capacity. And they essentially piloted this idea of helping students in these communities access learning that could involve virtual field trips and experts. And they grew it to about 5 schools. And the data that was coming out of the research showed an increase in interest and attendance by students. And so it was obvious that it offered promise, and they were looking for a charity that could help to take it from a proof of concept to a kind of a program that was lasting. And that timing was really good for us because we were on this journey of listening and understanding, collaborating with communities in the North to understand what contributions we could make given our skills. And so we agreed as a charity to take over that program and build an ecosystem of partners around it. And as I mentioned, the real focus for us as it's grown from 5 schools to 125 today, serving about 25,000 students in those remote communities, is really centering the perspectives of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis experts, knowledge keepers, artists, authors. We have over 100 partners now that are delivering that learning on a daily basis. This year, we've already delivered over 4,000 live interactive sessions, more than all of last year. So it's grown about 40% year over year. And I think for us, it's about addressing that. It's almost a leapfrogging, thinking of my son in grade 4 here in Toronto. There's lots of institutions in Toronto, but they haven't been able to go on any field trips this year. And so now we have students in the North and our more remote communities. Some schools are doing a field trip every day. They're doing at least one a week is our promise, but we have many schools that are eagerly adopting those opportunities. So that's the Connected North program. I know you shared the link in the chat, Lucy. And during COVID, with many schools having to close, we thought a lot about how we could develop on-demand content that brings some of those same stories, some of those same resources to life, but allowing students to access it at home. And so we launched 3 different initiatives, well, 2 and one brand new one. One was called Fireside Chats. This is a series of stories of over 100 Indigenous role models and mentors across career categories. So students can click on a career they might be interested in, and they can read dozens of stories that are all written by Indigenous journalists and illustrated by a First Nations and an Inuit illustrator to reflect on different journeys, different career paths, and what they might be interested in. And this is all kind of free content. There's also a series of lesson plans and discussion guides for classrooms that have been written to allow this to be more broadly shared. The second initiative is called Create to Learn. So thinking about, how are we building students' digital skills, storytelling skills? This is really important because for a lot of the communities we partner with, preserving traditional knowledge and strengthening Indigenous languages, which in many cases are at risk because of the residential school system and because of the lack of knowledge speakers, is really important. So Create to Learn similarly works with over 50 different Indigenous creatives, similar to Masterclass, where we've essentially sourced these amazing, inspiring, creative professionals, and we funded them all to create a training series on different topics. So from how to mix your own music, to how to edit videos, to how to launch a business on Shopify, to how to fly a drone. We've got hundreds of hours of free skill building learning content. And there's also a number of cultural teachings from Indigenous communities here too. And last year we launched a series of lesson plans and even a textbook that we self-published on Amazon, where teachers can access this for the classroom. So really looking at, how can we bring the expertise that communities have to share out to a much wider audience? And we've preloaded this content because, as you can imagine, bandwidth in these communities is scarce. There's over 100 gigs of content that we've preloaded, and we're granting over 1,000 laptops this year as digital inclusion grants to students in those remote communities, so that they can actually have access to that content without the bandwidth. The third project I know you asked me to talk about, Lucy, is Your Voice is Power, but maybe I'll stop for a minute and we'll come back to that one.
Yeah, I just want, Larry was asking, when do children have access to personal computers and other devices, in general? What's the access like? Obviously, they need the devices since you have the grant, but I'm wondering before the grant, or what was it like?
Yeah, I would say, I mean, it's access is difficult. The devices are very expensive. There aren't, there's no Best Buy, so everything has to be flown in. All of the communities in Nunavut are fly-in only, and so shipping costs are quite cost prohibitive. And also, they're satellite only communities, and satellite, due to COVID, especially bandwidth on those satellites has been stretched, and Starlink is getting there soon. They're not quite there, but it will be there in the next year, and OneWeb and a few other options. But I would say that generally access to technology has been a challenge, and we've tried to contribute to it with digital inclusion grants. This current government has made a lot of investments in both bandwidth and access to devices, but I would say they're still nowhere close to one-to-one access. I think in many cases there may be a device shared at home in families, but often there's also a kind of a housing crisis in many of those communities. So there's multiple families sharing a home, multiple families sharing a device. And with students now, as they graduate, being forced in many cases to do online learning for at least this last year of university, they're now requiring those devices to learn. So they're really kind of stretched thin in terms of access. I couldn't say that every community is the same, but just generally, due to the cost of living and the cost of housing, there have been other priorities that have made access to technology more cost prohibitive.
Yeah, I would imagine. So, how has the pandemic impacted the Connected North project in general, and some of these other projects? Has there been and the communities that they serve too? I'd be curious as to how that's played out for you in Canada a little bit.
Yeah, obviously, due to that lack of bandwidth, it meant that there wasn't the same opportunity to shift to online learning that the communities experience. So that's why we prioritized. We started in 2020 with 500 devices, and then we got funded last year to do 2,000 devices. So we'll do 1,000 last year and this year. And we prioritize grade 11 and 12 students just because they're the closest to graduation. We feel like they're the ones that also have the most need in that transition to do online courses and kind of supplement the learning loss during COVID. So what teachers had to do in many of those communities that we're aware of is they actually had to create paper-based learning packages and distribute them kind of door to door in some communities to students. So obviously that was a lot to do quickly. So some of the educators in our team actually worked on developing kind of culturally relevant resources that address the curriculum that the teachers were trying to address, but also used culturally relevant examples and were kind of worksheet based. So there wasn't that ability to have access to online learning supports. The logistics and infrastructure challenges also, as I mentioned, with everyone having to work from home, all the government employees, for example, all of a sudden those satellite connections were even more stretched. There was virtually no bandwidth, even if there was money to pay for it, because we did have money in 2000 to buy additional bandwidth for some students. The satellite providers just said there's no capacity. We have to wait till next year before that next satellite launches. So because of the population being lower, some of these regions haven't been as prioritized for these types of services. And it's great to see now with increased competition with Starlink, their polar orbit satellites coming online in the next 6 to 12 months, that will drastically change and improve accessibility for those communities.
So, how many kids do you think you served through? You said 4,000 streamed sessions this year. How many students are basically involved with this kind of work? I'm out of
Uh,
curiosity.
Yeah, just over 25,000 right now in the remote communities that we serve. So there's some larger high schools in the capital cities, Iqaluit, Yellowknife, Whitehorse, that we serve. But there's also schools of 30 students with 2 teachers, where there might be one high school graduate a year, right? In Arctic Bay, which is one of the more northern communities. So yeah, it goes from a high school in a capital, which might be similar to the size of a small high school in another community, but then there's also very small schools with just 1 or 2 teachers and principals.
Wow, that's amazing. Do you want to show us the Create to Learn platform? Because I was just amazed how um, and tell us a little bit more about that, because when you showed this to me a couple months ago, um, the kids can program in their native language in it, which I thought was just brilliant. And tell us a little bit more about your partnership with Georgia Tech on this, and the US version of it too. I think it would be great to see.
Definitely. Yeah. So that program is actually called Your Voice is Power. So that's the third one. So Create to Learn is the kind of skill sharing platform. And then Your Voice is Power is a program, as you mentioned, it was started by Georgia Tech, Yellow, Pharrell Williams Foundation, and Amazon Future Engineer in the United States. And the concept there was based on Pharrell's song Entrepreneur with Jay-Z. And the Ear Sketch programming language allows students essentially to code music. So they can use Python or JavaScript, and then they can select beats from different artists. So this year they've added Alicia Keys and Khaled. And so they can go in and say, I want to take this beat from Pharrell or this beat from Common, or we've added 3 Indigenous artists, Dakota Bear, Jay Lee Wolf, and Samyan. And then they can essentially learn through the curriculum some different commands in Python, and they can essentially construct songs that they can then play. So I don't think that'll necessarily come through, but basically it's essentially a programming language connection to music. And so the program curriculum, Your Voice is Power, which is available both in Canada and the US, and soon in a few other countries too, is essentially a curriculum in the case of Canada, where we've focused on these 3 Indigenous artists and the lyrics and meaning and the Indigenous histories that are shared through their music. And so it's essentially a set of curriculum modules where students learn about music, they learn about coding, they learn about Indigenous and Canadian histories through analyzing and deconstructing the music of Jay Lee, Samyan, and Dakota. And then they're able to create their own song, mixing their beats. And we're awarding 2 $5,000 scholarships in June for the Indigenous and non-Indigenous ally student that create the most compelling songs. So this is something that, we wrapped up 2 rounds with Pharrell's music, and now we're really focusing on Indigenous artists. In the US, there's a kind of parallel program and the thing that's exciting is we've heard some of the US students have now discovered the Indigenous student beats from Canada, and they're mixing together like Alicia Keys with Dakota Bear's beats. So it's really cool to see them, looking at the meaning behind this music. And Georgia Tech has a professor of hip hop who's actually created a lot of the background content in these modules. But I'm really excited to see people start using this, and for students to, I think music is such a hook. For us, our approach to coding education, and we've been lucky here in Canada to have a national coding initiative called CanCode that's invested tens of millions of dollars a year into about 25 nonprofits, including us, to do kind of innovative approaches to coding. For us, we call that project Code to Learn. It's not about learning to code, but it's, how can we infuse coding into many different subjects, and art and music have been 2 focuses for us. So this is a program I'm particularly proud of, and it was developed by 2 Indigenous educators in Winnipeg in collaboration with a number of other translators. And as you mentioned, Lucy, it is also available in Inuktitut and Ojibwe, which are 2 Indigenous languages. Inuktitut used mostly in Inuit communities in Nunavut, and Ojibwe here in Ontario. So when they're coding, they're actually able to use that interface, the Ear Sketch interface now in Inuktitut. And so it can strengthen the language learning priority as it also, teaches the coding and music. So I'm pretty excited about Your Voice is Power.
How do you keep up with all these projects, out of curiosity? Because you have so many different avenues and partners and exciting things going on all the time. How do you do it? Your wife is your co-founder on this, so I know that you 2 work for Taking It Global. But do you have like a huge staff? What's the story?
I think that what we learned early on, and the work that we did that actually developed this, that Ariel and Melina were a part of, was a cross-Canada mapping of youth-led and highly youth-engaged organizations. And I would say that one of the strengths of our work, I feel, is the fact that we take a partnership-driven approach. And as you can see, Taking It Global as an organization is almost invisible from a lot of these initiatives. We try to think about how we can create different programs, initiatives, resources that are as open as possible, often Creative Commons based where we can, that invite other organizations to feel and take shared ownership, and contribute to them in ways that we can also recognize and support. So we have another program that's kind of Canada specific called Rising Youth, which offers small grants of up to $1,500 for youth who are launching a social change project, kind of building on work we've done over the last 2 decades to try to unlock money for student voice all around the world. I think it's great if you inspire people to action, but if you can put some money behind it within a school or within a system, it's even more powerful. And that program has over 100 formal MOU partners where we're actually sharing those resources with other organizations to promote and adopt and support young people along these pathways, wherever they are. So I would say the only way we're able to keep up is essentially through partnerships, through sharing creation, sharing ownership, sharing the pride, I think, in this work with as many other folks as possible, and really trying to deprioritize our brand. Like, as I mentioned, the Taking a Global website is woefully out of date, I'll admit. It's working on being revamped, but we've been so focused on creating all of these partnership driven initiatives that, our core, it's almost like a bit of an incubator for these innovations, but it's really the partnerships that bring it to life and make it possible.
So when we started the Global Education Conference, we wanted it to be an umbrella organization for people who were doing global work. And because we found like there was no one place where you could go and find the best, if you were a teacher or a school looking for programs, there wasn't a place where you could go and find out information about whatever was offered. And the idea was that together we can do more, and that if we share, and every organization was very unique, I felt that worked with us. It was also very, what I've seen, at least in U.S. nonprofits, is more of a approach that they're focused on themselves and their mission and their goal, and as opposed to thinking more broadly about how these partnerships can enhance the work of everybody. Like, there's enough work and enough interesting creative things going on. It feels to me that sharing and partnering is a much more powerful way to, in Don's favorite word, amplify opportunities for youth and for teachers. And so this is fascinating to me, because I see people feel like they have to double down and focus on their own thing and not embrace other groups. And so I would love to see more organizations. This is more of a comment than a question, but I would love to see more organizations take this kind of approach to seeing what could happen as a result of partnerships, as opposed to doing exclusively their own thing.
And I think some of that comes from the kind of scarcity mindset that exists in the charitable sector, because, often funders are providing short-term funding. We don't have many 5 to 10-year commitments. Everyone is funding in like 1-year commitments. So everyone is kind of worried about, oh, what'll happen if I don't promote my brand, if people don't remember us. I think, I do think those challenges are real. And I think that it's nice to see some funders out there providing less restrictive gifts, like Mackenzie Scott, right? Where, no strings attached, believe in your mission, see that you do good work. I think I think it would help if there were funders that were more intentional about creating those type of collaborations. And in fact, since it's Earth Day, we have a collaboration in Canada called the Environmental Damages Fund, where the Canadian government took the Volkswagen penalties and they invested them into a series of collaborations between nonprofits. And they actually forced the groups that work with at least one other large organization in their application. So you had to apply as a collaborative. So I think funders could be more clever about, incentivizing that type of collaboration as well, because I think often what gets incentivized, it will happen.
And I see in the U.S. that the other thing that I've noticed too in Europe is that there's funding for global citizenship type of activities, because it's a priority. So either coming from the EU or Erasmus, or big organizations that are affiliated with EU, there seems to be a bucket of money for schools and for teachers to get training or to pursue projects that are related to that. In the US, the funding has been really on STEM and STEAM, not so much on broader initiatives. It's what the people with the power and the money want to see coming forward, as opposed to looking at the work and seeing what's worthy of funding. I think, like, so Mackenzie's approach, I think, is along those lines. It's just really fascinating to me. So a lot of the people that we know in the US are really struggling to kind of keep afloat from a financial perspective because of these constraints. And I would love it in the US to see a rethinking of how we do this sort of thing. But anyway, this is something that we want to talk about further. We're going to revive the Global Ed Conference in November, and I think that we should have a panel kind of on creative approaches to funding and what we want funders to know. because I
And
think
just
there's
on
some
that
room for
note, I think
improvement.
one of the things that also kind of bothers me a little bit is how much money is given to post-secondary institutions and how little is given to K-12. Like how many of us have donated to our middle school or high school, right? But our universities are really good at asking for that money. So, how could we create more capacity at the K-12 level to engage and to fund these type of programs and partnerships, right? Because I think the challenge that many of us face is that we're trying to fundraise to deliver these programs for free because our K-12 schools don't have budget. But imagine if they did, imagine if they could drive, and not to say they have no budget, but often budget is locked into kind of capital intensive things. There's what's paid to teachers, there's capital, and then there's often a huge capital backlog. So there's a multi-billion-dollar backlog of repairs alone to schools. So I'd love to see those districts, those systems get better at that fundraising to unlock money from parents and from the public willing to give, and make sure that's also done equitably, right? So it's not just, there's been many cases of parents' councils, meaning that they're creating huge divides between have and have nots at individual schools, but at the systems level. And that could fund things like some of these innovations in PD that are needed and could be then funded. The work that we're all doing, could be better funded by the systems and not having to rely on tech philanthropists who have their own agendas.
Yeah, and I'm kind of that's totally. I think that I don't think people necessarily know about education if they just because you have a lot of money doesn't mean that you know education, and we seem to worship bow to that often. So we've got about 10 minutes left, everybody, and sometimes we go over, Michael. So if you want to stick around, we'll stop recording at the top of the hour and we can have more of an informal conversation. But I'm wondering if anybody in the room wants to grab the mic and ask Michael a question about something that we've talked about or something that we haven't talked about yet. I'd love to have some questions from you, friends.
And just on that note, I'll just paste, there was a great article I remember in the Washington Post about, Bill and Melinda Gates, I think it was about a year and a half ago, saying they don't want billionaires to influence education policy, but this article was kind of looking at, well, what are the things they've been funding over the last decade, and were those things all good? So I know there's some great thought leadership on this space.
Small schools, and there's been a lot of different kinds of approaches that haven't been particularly effective, and all this money thrown at it. For sure. Anybody, come on, step up to the mic. Don, do you have a question? Do you want to share? Ask anything?
I just want to comment, Michael. I hear you about the funding piece. I started a not-for-profit with a design agency called Tools at Schools, where the idea was to have students co-design products that we would bring to market. And we had successful runs with Staples, PepsiCo, stuff like that. But the problem with the funding was because of the work we were doing, you often didn't know the deliverable. And because you don't know the deliverable, no one wanted to fund us, so I kept saying, well, fund us for a surprise, but that's what drove us under, because we couldn't sustain any sort of funding. And so I hear you about more creative ways to fund think programs like that for K-12.
Yeah, and who funds the process, right? The thinking, the development. Like foundations expect you to come with this fully baked, perfect proposal, and we've had several situations where they say, "Oh, prove that that's needed." We're like, "Okay, we go away and do all this work," and they still end up rejecting it. So it's I think having an ecosystem of funders that fund processes, fund the development, and are comfortable with less structure at the beginning is important.
Yeah, absolutely.
Hi, I'm Aaron Shore, and I had a quick question. So much of my work in education is trying to decolonize what school has done to young learners in middle school and high school. And so much of that is rooting these educational experiences in their identities and who they are outside of school. How have you successfully done that? How have the identities of your young learners either been at the forefront or been a part of the organizations you're building or the communities you're building?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it kind of goes back to the student voice movement and the student voice. We developed a graduate level course on student voice. I think for us, it really, with Connected North, a lot of that comes from thinking about ways that, thinking of representation, how we can have students play a role in identifying the role models and mentors and people that they look up to. and that they want to see included in their learning. The next phase of the Fireside Chats program that we've just raised money for is actually to invest in students to take an active role in deciding who are the next cohort of Fireside Chat people that we're going to highlight, and actually funding students, funding those community members, and then funding the journalists and illustrators to tell those stories. So kind of giving students control and investing in their wisdom, their expertise, their interests, right? Because I think where we've seen the learning through Connected North, for example, be most successful is when it's aligned not just to curriculum, which is important to get in the door, but how do we really center like students' interests and, as you say, the cultural experiences that they want to or they often need to reconnect with because they were lost. They don't know what was lost because of the residential school system and the experiences that were lost. So I think for us, part of it is building capacity around student voice and raising awareness of that. And I didn't have a chance to talk about it yet, but we took all of that professional learning that was built around student voice, environmental stewardship, and social innovation. There were 3 graduate level courses, and Lucy knows this, but we've taken all of that work and made it freely available, open online as kind of a MOOC that people can build on. So I welcome folks to have a look at that link I've just pasted and steal anything there that's useful, because we worked with some great folks on student voice. But I think that part of it is the professional learning capacity around student voice. And then the other part is just ensuring that in the programming we deliver, as much as possible, we are investing in students' ideas directly through initiatives like the Rising Youth Grants I talked about. We have a youth leadership fund as well through Connected North that provides up to $2,500 for a student that wants to implement an idea or create a cultural production that is related to an inspiration they had through their learning. So whether that's a music video they want to film, a training they want to attend, something they want to do to then bring that knowledge back to their community. Many youth in the Connected North communities are what people talk about as NEET youth, NEET, not in education, employment, or training. So how can we provide really accessible funding to allow them to either implement an idea or build that cultural knowledge, expertise that they want to see represented in their learning themselves? So there's been a lot of really powerful storytelling books. I think we've published now 6 or 7 books with students in communities for them, with their community members, with the knowledge keepers, and ultimately getting more money into the classroom for those student ideas, whatever that looks like, whether that's directly to the student through advocacy or through initiatives like these funds. But definitely something we aspire to do. And I hope with Fireside Chats, I'm excited to see who students choose and who they bring in. And I hope they'll be as excited as we are in having designed that funding and getting to play a role in deciding who those next 200 role models are, and seeing that represented in the next generation for their kids to learn from. There's a lot to undo in terms of the harms of the past, for sure. Just at the beginning of that. Thank you.
Anybody else have a question? That was excellent, Erin. Thank you.
One quick comment and one small question. I think the funders, if they can do a lot to influence sort of the competitiveness between the organizations going after funds, if they put in requirements or expectations that there be some collaboration and sharing across channels. And so often it's an all or nothing on getting funds with a lot of the things that are issued. The actual question though is, and it's my own lack of knowledge here in the US, are there any ways that some of this would be replicable or transferable to some of the tribal schools, tribal communities here in the US, and who best works with those groups? I mean, I know there's the Bureau of Indian Education, but I've never been particularly enchanted with what I've heard from them. So is there groups here that are more particularly focused on the tribal schools?
I'm not sure. I'm not too familiar with the US context. I know in Canada, those First Nation schools in particular were funded federally, and all other schools were funded provincially by our provinces or states. And typically the funding per student was about 30% less for those federally funded First Nations on reserve schools. And so that created a bit of a significant inequity from the beginning because they had less money to work with. But what we're seeing now as one of the recommendations of the Truth and Reconciliation Committee and process is that funding decisions and that money is being given directly to communities. So instead of those communities and schools having to apply for federal funding every year, this current government, I think, has made a wise decision to transfer that funding, that control, that decision making regionally and locally. I think there's more work that could be done in the capacity building process. I think it's been a little bit rushed, but I think that's a healthy move to ensure that the communities can choose what their priorities are and decide how to invest the funds, and not have some, bureaucrat in the federal government making those decisions on their behalf. So I'm not sure how the funding model works in the US, but the borders are arbitrary. We have a number of communities, whether it's in Yukon, bordering Alaska, or Akwesasne, which borders both Ontario, Quebec, and New York State, that are across the border. So I don't see why some of the ideas shared. I think the core concept of representation and learning, I think, is universal. And I think that often, I think there's probably some work to be done in terms of funding and control. And I welcome discovery of what that could look like in the US, because it may not be the same in terms of geographic remoteness as in the same way that Canada's North has, but I certainly am aware there's a number of digital divide issues within the US and within some of these communities that are underserved by traditional providers. So I think the next few years will be particularly interesting with initiatives like Starlink, disrupting some of those companies that have maybe sat on their toes for too long without investing in infrastructure because there weren't enough people to justify it. Well, now they're going to have a lot of other options. Larry had a great question in the chat too about what's the big carrot for funders? Does the carrot limit their interest? I think it's hard to know. I think for some funders, especially like some of the wealthy tech philanthropists, what it seems like is that they want to, directly implement an idea they have. And so they're choosing perhaps organizations who are willing to do that with or for them, rather than really seeking out the best tested or scaled, or the best person who might have the capacity to create the best outcomes. I think they have an outcome in mind that they're investing towards, rather than just trying to strengthen the system. That's my thought, but yeah, be open. That's a whole other session, maybe.
Hey, Tracy.
Hi. Michael, hi. This is my classroom also, so I've been working and listening. So if you said something like this and I didn't hear you, sorry. But I have friends. I'm actually Canadian also. Montreal, though, sorry. Michael Furdyk died today too. That was kind of sad, but whatever. Do you do any work with logo or links rather? Because I have friends, Peter Skillen and Brenda, who are work up with the same organizations that you're working with that use links and that. Do you work with that at all?
Yeah, definitely. So Brenda and Peter work with us. Brenda's on our team with Connected North as well. So she works kind of half-time on Connected North and half-time on the links program. And so the Code to Learn program I mentioned, that's kind of the umbrella and the funding we've received from the federal government that supports all the great work that they do. So it was really an honor. Brenda and Peter are two folks through ISTE that
awesome.
I would say have been like mentors and people that have taught me a lot. And so it was an honor to be able to secure the funding to enable a lot of them to kind of scale knowledge about the approaches that they've demonstrated are really effective.
They're really awesome with that. Yeah. I taught.
So we're part of the same community.
Okay, cool. I was just hearing that and just wanted to. Yeah, I taught. My sister teaches at Montcrest, and I did. She teaches math, so I've been doing like zooming in and doing like the coding part using links for her school for the last couple of years. So it's been really fun to be able to do that. But it's great that the initiative, like it's part of the math program, in middle school stuff. So it's great.
Yeah. Lucy asked about the connection with microworlds. So Lucy, links is kind of the new web-based microworlds.
Yeah. So a weird thing is like Michael Quinn, like I've been connected, I've known him since we were like this tall, and he was the one that did LCSI and put microworlds together. So links is the latest iteration of that. And it kind of came apart at the same time as the Code to Learn stuff in Canada and the curriculum and all that initiative. So whether you're talking about Indigenous communities or just my sister's private or independent school in Toronto, all the kids are learning to code, and it's very specific. Like if you go to the actual curriculum in the math, in the like Ontario math, it's actually talks specifically about the links programming language and things like that, which is local. Yeah. So it's the same. So it's pretty cool.
Julene also asked a question about the. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Lucy.
I was just saying I started with Micro Worlds in 2000 teaching it to kids, and I loved it, and it was a great environment. And I was wondering what, I'm not in the classroom anymore, so I was wondering what happened to it. So it's great to know.
You can, if you're Canadian, you can have links for free, but if you're American, you have to pay. Anyway, sorry. Well, I'm just saying, if you wanted to, kind of get involved.
You could apply for citizenship, Lucy.
I'll support you. I'll sponsor you.
Julene had a question just about SDGs and whether the majority of Canadian schools were aligned and adopting them. I would say there is pretty broad awareness. I know our Prime Minister actually just agreed to join like the SDG kind of Ambassadors Council globally. I think there's a lot more that could be done, but there have been a lot of investments made by our government around promotion of the SDGs, developing initiatives and resources. But, I still feel like it's probably 20%, not 80%, if you really looked at statistically, how many people are actually incorporating and aligning to them, but it's something that's definitely growing as a movement.
Okay, I'm going to stop recording just for a second, so that people can, if they want to talk and not be recorded, they can do that. I have different devices here, so let me